Good evening and welcome to the wrap-up of round 12 in Tata Steel. There is maybe not so much excitement left in the Masters group. Caruanas had a fantastic second week. He started off with one victory and six draws in the beginning, or no, one victory and five draws, and now he got 5.5 out of 6 during the second week. And we have the world champion Magnus trying to keep up. He had a great week too with 4.5 out of 6, but unfortunately that was not enough. And the winner of Masters 2020 is Fabiano Caruana. So we will look closer into his game from today. We still have a lot of excitement in the challengers. Another draw for the Swedish Grandelius, but we have the Spanish Anton who lost today to Warmerdam from the Netherlands. And this invited a couple of other players to fight for the first place and become the challenger for 2021. So we will end with the Grandelius game and start with Caruana and Dubov victories in the Masters. So let's see what happened. We have d4 from Fabi, answered with knight f6, and we got Catalan. There's a lot of different ways to target the pawn on c4. You can play, for example, knight a3, trying to bring the knight over to c4 and access e5 quickly. At the same time, black usually plays c3 just to disturb the pawns. Then maybe, for example, c5. And try to create some disturbances in the center. But there's other options also. You can play, for example, c5. Very normal move. The advantage for white in Catalan is that the bishop on g2, which got the diagonal a8, h1, is better than the one on c8. So white is targeting to get some initiative to bring the rook to the c file quickly, because the bishop on c8 will be in the way, and to create some initiative. But Fabi chose to play queen to a4 and c6 from Duda. Another option is, for example, to bring the bishop out, put it on c6, just to try to fight the diagonal a8, h1. But we have c6, a little bit more passive way forward, and after queen takes c4, b5. So Duda is trying to get some space on the queen side, but the problem is the c5 square. This will be a weakness, and if black managed to play c5 himself, he's completely okay, but white will not allow it, and if it's not possible to play c5, then he might get in trouble and the pawn on c6 might be weak. So we have queen to b3, bishop b7, bringing the rook over to the d file, same file as the queen. So for example, c5 is not possible, just collecting, and the queen got to move. So developing the knight, and Fabi is jumping in, trying to target c6 immediately. Exchange on e5 and the next knight to d7. Because that if he would go to d5, you only have e4 and the knight is lost. So knight d7 is the only move to not lose the piece. Bishop to f4 protecting e5. And at the same time developing and preparing the c1 square for the rook from a1. Queen to c7 targeting the pawn again, but Fabi is just developing with knight c3. Duda don't want to take this knight because it will be pinned, and at the same time, for example, after an exchange, he might just enter with the rook, and the bishops are in trouble. So we have knight c5 and queen going back, and b4. A very important move, otherwise, for example, after a6, white will be able to play b4. The knight don't have so many squares, and white can target c6. So the knight rerouting, going back. Now he wants to use c4 as the weak spot, just planting the knight here, maybe eventually jumping into d6. Sometimes if the queen move, he's able to play knight a5, targeting the white square bishop and c6. And we have bishop a6. Fabi is protecting e2, rook to c8 and a3. Now Fabi wants to open the a file for the rook, because he can notice that knight to d2 and c4 maybe don't bring that much for him, because Duda can just exchange. He's covering the square. So he's trying to open up on the a file, and maybe even bringing the knight up to c4 via a3, and creating two very weak pawns on a7 and c6. Rook to b8. A big mistake. You need to either close the file or somehow protect it, because b3 is a very natural move, not allowing white to open up the a file. Sure, he will get the c3 square, maybe moving the queen and then putting the knight up there, but then black can start advancing, for example, knight to a4 and pushing the pawn. Just taking the square on c3 from this knight, maybe exchange, and try to equalize. So after a3, rook b8, a huge blunder by Duda, because this is completely winning now for Fabi. The bishop on a6 is in trouble. It's threatened. There's a threat on the knight. So after taking the pawn, Fabi attacks the knight. If the knight move, then the bishop is hanging. There might have been another way forward instead of playing bishop e3, just to make it quicker, go for the rook. The rook got to move, and the only place is to go to b6 to cover a6, because after b4 it's possible to move the knight, and the bishop is covered by the rook. But then we have, for example, a bishop e3, targeting the knight again. The rook is behind, and there are some problems. Maybe got to move the bishop b4 and exchanging here. But at the same time, moving the bishop is not possible because the knight is hanging immediately. So bishop e3 might have been the right way forward. Maybe queen b7, or then the knight is hanging again. Yeah, it's very hard to find something good here for Duda. But Fabi started with bishop e3 targeting the knight, and Duda got queen b7. So now he's at least collecting a few pawns. So Fabi played knight to d2, for example, taking, take, and just move the queen. At the same time, if he takes on c5, there is rook to c4, and the bishop is hanging. Something like this. And black is completely fine. So this might have been what Fabi overlooked, and didn't play bishop d2, bishop e3. After queen b7 we have knight to d2, and he's targeting c5 again. Duda grabs a pawn and tries to cover the knight. Rook to a3, and Fabi will double up on the a file. Still, white got the initiative. He will probably collect a7 and c6 eventually, but he could have finished the game with a quicker win if he would play more correct with bishop d2. Duda trying to free the bishop. Feels like Duda is playing correct here, targeting e5. Now, for example, after he plays rook d8, but it's not possible to take here because when taking with the rook, it's possible to just take on b7. But at the same time, even here you can just pin the rook and start collecting. So after knight c4, rook to d8, bishop to e4, trying to reroute some pressure on the king side on h7. At the same time, he's grabbing a nice positional advantage. Want to centralize the queen on e4, so he's waiting for Duda to take on e4. For example, something like this. And then it's possible to play rook to a8. Still maybe the right way forward for Duda, but for the moment he's just creating some air for the king, and yeah, he's not he, he don't have to take on e4 and allow the queen to get centralized position. Knight f8, and Fabi chose to keep the bishop. Still a really nice initiative for white, and he managed to collect the 2 pawns on a7 and c6 earlier, now on c5, and just keeping up the pressure. These 2 bishops on d3 and d2 are amazing, playing on both sides, sometimes even creating possibilities to reroute the queen to e4 and target a checkmate when the pieces start moving. So Duda is more or less keeping the guard up, trying to save a draw and exchange some pieces. And Fabi, he got some concrete things coming up here. F4, for example, if taking on d6, pawn takes, and a very dangerous pawn. At the same time, it's not possible to threat because of e4, moving the bishop, and e5, and the pawn is protected, bringing the bishops over, entering with the rook, and the pawn will be queening. So f4, bishop d8, trying to reroute the bishop to a more active diagonal over here on b6, a7, g1 diagonal, just to get some activity for the bishops. Getting out with the knight. c5 might be a little bit too early, but at the same time he wants to put the knight on c5. For example, bishop b6, it's just possible to take maybe something like this, but yeah, the rook is entering and white got really nice advantage, even picking up f7 maybe. So we have g5 to start with, creating more air around the king, trying to exchange some pawns, even making e5 weaker. So for example, if taking here, just taking back and targeting e5. So Fabi played bishop to d4. We have rook to b4. Not really sure if that is the right way forward. Maybe f6 could be one possibility to try to just exchange some pawns and weaken up the strong center of Caruana here. For example, taking, sure, this pawn will be weak, but then taking back, trying to exchange another piece. You probably got to take, and we have less pawns on the board, and the possibility for drawing is increasing for black. Played rook to b4. The king is coming. Maybe e3 was more correct, but at the same time, centering the king is not wrong. Maybe the wrong way forward to exchange here, opening the g file. So Fabi might create even some play on the g file. He got the a file to enter to a7, maybe eventually to a8 when the bishop on d5 is not covering the square. So the proper way again might have been f6, trying to get rid of some pawns, but after rerouting the bishop to d4, yeah, maybe Fabi got some move in between, for example rook to a7, target the knight. But I'm not really sure about this kind of position. Still feels okay for black if he managed to exchange a pawn at the same time, keep a double pawn for white. So he took on f4, Fabi playing bishop to b5, attacking the knight, and a knight sacrifice to grab the bishop on d4. So after taking the rook, we have a check on f6. The king got to move and the rook is hanging on a1. And here it's black maybe having a slight advantage, but it's gonna be a draw. So knight f6, a really nice move, trying to get some activity. But after collecting, Fabi don't have to take the rook, he can activate his own rook. So now threatening rook to c8 to pick up the bishop. And Duda took the pawn on f6. And we have rook to c7 and the game is over. Everything is falling apart and it feels like Duda can't protect the bishop. He will lose a piece. Might have been another option here. Something like bishop to g2 trying to target the knight. But the problem is that the rook is hanging. So after rook to c1, he got to take on f6 to protect the rook. Or even if moving the rook, we have rook c8 and the game is over. So takes on f6, rook to c7, and Fabi is collecting the piece. Duda is trying to target both the knight and the bishop, but there's a check in between and Fabi can save the piece. And the game is over. Duda gave up. And congratulations to Fabi for an amazing second week and the first place in the Masters group. So let's move on to the other victory in the Masters with Dubov against you. Interesting matchup. Young Dubov against the Chinese star Yu Yangyi. We have a Slav setup from Yu Yangyi trying to play safe. Dubov is giving away the dark square bishop. Usually the bishop is somehow kept. Sometimes you put it on f4 instead, so after targeting you get some weaknesses for black. You have the h file and sometimes these pawns might become weak, sometimes strong after e5. But he chose bishop g5, there's nothing wrong with this. e3, some castling, and Dubov is trying to get quick initiative on the c file. Maybe a slight mistake from you here, taking the knight, because the dark square bishop in this kind of structure with the pawns on the light squares, it's a bishop you want to have on d6 just to cover up all the dark squares. Sometimes even push e5 and create some active play against the king. So other kind of maybe normal move would be a5. So after a3 just going back. Very balanced position. Maybe even sometimes it's possible to take on c4 and play e5. Just to open up, because black got the bishop pair. But okay, he took on c3 and took on c4. Dubov is grabbing the d file to start with, so if you push either c5 or e5, then he can simply just take the pawn and the rook is already starting to be active on the d file. So we have c5, taking on c4, and moving the queen to create some possibility for the other rook to enter on the c file. Bishop to b5, it's not possible to take it, and at the same time he wants to grab um, the file from, or the diagonal a8 h1 immediately with the tempo. He's stopping bishop b7 because, for example, if he would go back, instead of going to b5, he goes back, then bishop b7, and there are no problems for black. He got the diagonal. He will manage to exchange a pawn here, enter c5 maybe with the knight. Or if the pawn takes to block the squares on c5 and e5, it's possible to play b5 later and enter with the knight to d5, because d5 square will be weak. And Dubov chose the only way forward to keep the initiative. It's not possible, after bishop b5, it's not possible to play a move like bishop b7 because the knight is hanging. Sure, still maybe there might be drawing chances, but the king will sneak out to e1 d2 eventually, and white will win with the piece up. So we have rook to d8 preparing bishop b7, bishop c6, and rook to a7. This move is maybe wrong. It's probably better to put the rook on b8, have the possibility to play b5, and later, let's say for example rook c1. b5 might not work immediately, but yeah, taking the pawn to start with and maybe playing b5. Sure, it's still white having the initiative, entering maybe with the knight, and it looks dangerous, but uh, there are some chances still to keep it together. After a move like rook to a7, the rook is stuck on a7 and it's never possible to play b5 because it will just be hanging. Dubov took on c5 immediately, knight takes, and queen to b4, targeting the pawn. It's a weak one. He can't push because the knight will be hanging on c5, and black is in trouble here. There are no proper solutions. It feels like he will be losing a pawn. And with the rook on b8, he could have been covering b6, and the bishop is covering a6. Maybe the only move, going back to d7, covering b6. The queen is entering, creating even a more dangerous pin. Moving the rook so it's not pinned, just to create the possibility to move the knight. And Dubov is preparing to double up. Knight c5, maybe an immediate losing move. Dubov doubled up, but there might have been a move like queen to b8, just picking up the rook. There are no proper squares, only squares to e7 and then b6 is hanging. The knight is in trouble, not really having proper squares either. For example, something like this, and just moving the queen. He's a pawn up, got the possibility to just start running with the pawn. Also, just taking and picking up a second pawn. But then b2 might be hanging and there are chances for black again. Probably no hurry. Just move the queen and, yeah, play on the queen side with 2 against 1. The bishop on c8 is not active, the c6 bishop is very active, a6 will be hanging eventually, and doubling up on the d file later. But he chose to double up immediately. Still, white having the initiative and pushing for the win, but a little bit slower way than maybe queen b8 immediately. We have knight to b7, another silly square for the knight. Neither the bishop can't get out or the knight. And chess is about creating possibilities for the pieces, and you is really in trouble here. f6, just to enable e5 to somehow create possibilities to go out with the pieces, develop them, and create some play. But it's very hard here. e5, another mistake maybe, because the squares are very weakened around the king. Should maybe have played f5 instead, but then the bishop goes back and everything is closed. A move like a5 might be correct, just to try to get a square on c5 as soon as possible. White will probably cover the square, but then it's 1 pawn less on the queen side and b4 might become weak. For example, playing rook to a4 and target the pawn. And after b5, the square on c5 is free for the knight, and there's some counterplay. But we have e5 on the board, rook to c1, threatening to enter with the rook to c7, and putting even more pressure on you, because then he will be completely stuck with the pieces on the queen side. He will not be able to move anything. Trying to avoid rook c7 and pinning the rook on a7. Dubov enters. b5 and rook to b6. Maybe the possibility in this position was to play a5 again, try to get loose somehow, but there's probably nothing wrong with this. Still, white is completely winning. Yu is fighting for getting some possibilities, but the initiative is completely with Dubov. He's just entering with the rooks. In this case, he even took on a6, but he had the possibility earlier, for example, in this position, just grabbing the bishop. The rook got to take this one. Rook targeting the pawn, maybe even starting with the check and target the pawn from behind. Sure, white got the 2 pieces, but the coordination of this knight is not that good, so it will take some time to bring it over to the game. At the same time, the rooks are getting active, can target a2 pretty quick. White is better, he will eventually put a bishop on d5 and play e4, cover everything and coordinate the knight. But what Dubov played was even better. He kept the pressure, because these 2 pieces, they can't do anything. This bishop is an amazing bishop, controlling the whole board, and after rook b6, moving the king, I'm not really sure why he did that. But rook to c2, probably king h8 was a possibility to try to pin this rook, giving two pieces again. Then the black got slight chances, but still white is completely winning. So Dubov just put pressure on the bishop, and at the same time he's threatening to take on b7 because rook to c7 would be covering the bishop. For example, king going back. Or let's say rook to e8 just to avoid the check on e5. Taking, rook to b8, and the rook entering. So we have rook to f7 covering b7, but then a6 is hanging. And Yu had enough, he gave up, because rook b8 is not fun to play. Maybe even something like rook a7, pinning everything. And if he takes the rook, there's a checkmate on the last rank. A nice game from Dubov, keeping the initiative the whole way and winning. Now he got a slight chance to become top 3 if the results in the top goes his way and he wins the last round. But at least Dubov will fight for top 5, if not a medal this year. Let's move on to the challengers. It's getting very exciting there, and unfortunately Grandelius played another draw and will not even have any chances to grab the first place. But let's see what happened. So we had Lamy against Grandelius. Lamy is a very solid player. Grandelius played the Grimfeld. G3, bishop G2 is more of a safe setup against many tricky variations in the Greenfield. Usually black want to have an open position and target some pawns in the center while white is grabbing the center and trying to advance and create something. This way Lamy got control, covering d4, no proper weaknesses, and Grandelius is trying to break the center just to create some play on these white squares on c4 and d3 because the bishop is on g3. Usually you have the bishop on e2, d3 covering the squares here and pushing in the center. We have d5 just to try to close the center, not open up the position for the dark square bishop. Now it's standing here and looking at the pawn on e5. Grandelius target d5 pawn, e4 covering, and c6 and castle. Sometimes you could maybe even push d6 here. The knight got to go back and then build up some kind of play here. Maybe f6, bishop e3 and rerouting over to a3. Maybe doubling up on the d file. This pawn will either be a very weak pawn and lost, or it will be very annoying and dangerous for black, because this knight don't have proper natural squares either on e7 or f6, and sometimes if you move this knight and start attacking, then d7 might be possible. So a tricky position, but Lamy chose the more safe way forward, castling. Grandelius managed to exchange on d5 and create another either weak or strong pawn. He got the majority on the king side. We have queen b3, stopping the king side to advance, for example f5, d6, having a check, and the knight will be hanging. But Grandelius, he simply took the pawn. He's losing e5, but after taking on c3, he's pinning the queen, and he can target the knight. Very nice, comfortable position for black. He got a target on e5 to play against. White don't have anything in general here, so a slight advantage for black. He can build up the game and target the pawn. White can start to try to exchange some pieces, but at the same time he's trying to maybe play h5 here to weaken up the king side, because for the moment there's no proper ideas for white. He just have to stand and cover e5. While Nils played the nice move, queen to e6 to target a2, but at the same time build up a possible exchange of the white square bishop. Exchanging the bishops, exchanging the rooks, and queen to d7. Maybe unnecessary, maybe a good move. For example, he could maybe even play something like rook to c8. If exchanging the rooks, it feels like black got the edge. Can play h5 later if h5 is not played immediately, then just taking, having a pawn up, having a safer king, and targeting e5. Might have been the right way forward. If the rook is moved, then the rook of Nils can enter and start creating problems. Something like this. But at the same time, white got the possibility to exchange the rook again. We have the queens and the bishops, which should be more comfortable to play like with the black pieces. h5 and simply target e5, centralizing the queen, maybe bringing the king over to e6, and try to push to at least win a pawn and slowly win the game. But both players don't have a proper chance to win the tournament, so queen d7 was more of an invite to a draw. We have queen e6, rook to f2, trying to create some dangerous tactics against f7 if the queen is moved. Queen goes back to d7, and they agree on a draw. Maybe a game where Nils could have taken the opportunity to exchange a rook with the rook c8 and target e5. Try to bring the king over to e6, but at the same time very drawish, not that easy to advance. And they agreed very quickly on a draw here. Nils didn't want to push. Guess Irvin was also happy, and let's see what happens in the last round. There are a couple of players having the opportunity to grab the challenger spot. We have Abdusatorov just half point behind, for example, having a really nice second half of the tournament with many victories. A young and talented player who would be fun to see in the Masters next year. Or let's see if the Spanish El Nino will keep it together and grab the spot. There's also Elyanov winning a nice game against Ganguly. He is fighting for the chance to join the Masters next year too. So don't miss tomorrow, we will go live about 2 hours into the games. See you tomorrow.